Hi, my name is Sebastian, and today I want to go over the age-old myth and question is of whether or not video games cause violence or not. Now, when people say video games cause violence, there's a lot of confusion to be had. So I'm going to be going over the three fundamental points. Is what type of video games may be causing violence. I want to go over misconceptions and false positives of why people think this, and I also want to go over that video games bring a lot more positives than causing violence. Now, one thing that before I dive into those points, I want to bring up that there's a lot of misconception to be had simply stating video games cause violence. It fails to take into account any other factor that may contribute to that, because violence has always been a thing in human history. Even before video games, there was wars, there's been murder, atrocities that had been committed without video games. So I just find it difficult to think that video games may have caused violence or may be a cause of it. Now, I also want to bring into the account of games. Simply stating video games cause violence isn't invalid an argument, because you're not taking into account what type of games. There's many types. There's educational games that we let our kids play, and then there's the more violent spectrum of shooting games. So what are they exactly talking about? And there's word games. So lots of those games have benefits and portray no violence at all. So it's very confusing. Now, if we take into account that these more mature games are the ones that they were referring to, and that's only if we assume that, then we have to look at, do we have any evidence? And I want to bring that there is simply no evidence, and that any evidence that or points that people have when it comes to video games being caused by violence are simply false positives. There was an example of this in 1999 Spike, when the first-person shooter called Doom had came out, and there had also incidentally been a school shooting that year. And so people attributed it to Doom as they had no other cause for it. But it's just because something happens does not mean once or a few times. There's been more throughout history, but I want to use that example because if we simply take that, that is not factual evidence that video games may be the cause of that. And it fails to look at any other factors that may have contributed in that. As in, what if the factor was the gun? No one ever says that, but somehow video games are thrown in there. And the last thing I want to go over and restate is that there's just no evidence that there are other factors and misconceptions. And lastly, I want to go over the benefits of video games. Some games improve memory. Some games reduce anxiety. Games are used in reducing depression, relieving stress. These are just the few benefits that games have. Games have been a part of our society for a decent amount. Games have always been a thing, but video games, a newer concept, just expands upon that. So that is why I conclude that video games are not a decent amount. There's not a decent amount of evidence to conclude that video games may contribute to violence.